This is the discourse entitled The Formation and Function of Sanskaras. There are two aspects of human experience, the subjective and objective. On the one hand, there are mental processes which constitute essential ingredients of human experience, and on the other hand, there are things and objects to which they refer. The mental processes are partly dependent upon the immediately given objective situation, and partly dependent upon the functioning of accumulated sanskaras or impressions of previous experience. The human mind thus finds itself between a sea of past sanskaras on the one side and the whole extensive objective world on the other. From the psychogenetic point of view, human actions are based upon the operation of the impressions stored in the mind through previous experience. Every thought, emotion, and act is grounded in groups of impressions which, when considered objectively, are seen to be modifications of the mind stuff of man. These impressions are deposits of previous experience and become the most important factors in determining the course of present and future experience. The mind is constantly creating and gathering such impressions in the course of its experience. When occupied with the physical objects of this world, such as the body, nature, and other things, the mind is, so to say, externalized and creates gross impressions. When it is busy with its own subjective mental processes, which are the expressions of already existing sanskaras, it creates subtle and mental impressions. The question whether sanskaras come first or experience comes first is like the question whether the hen or the egg comes first. Both are conditions of each other and develop side by side. The problem of understanding the significance of human experience, therefore, turns round the problem of understanding the formation and function of sanskaras. The sanskaras are of two types, natural and non-natural, according to the manner in which they come into existence. The sanskaras which the soul gathers during the period of organic evolution are natural sanskaras. These sanskaras come into existence as the soul successively takes up and abandons the various subhuman forms, thus gradually passing from the apparently inanimate state of the stone or metal to the human state, where there is full development of consciousness. All the sanskaras which cluster round the soul before it attains the human form are the product of natural evolution and are referred to as natural sanskaras. They should be carefully distinguished from the sanskaras cultivated by the soul after the attainment of the human form. The sanskaras which get attached to the soul during the human stage are cultivated under the moral freedom of consciousness with its accompanying responsibility of choice between good and bad, virtue and vice. They are referred to as non-natural sanskaras. Though these post-human sanskaras are directly dependent upon the natural sanskaras, they are created under fundamentally different conditions of life and are, in their origin, comparatively more recent than the natural sanskaras. This difference in length of the formative periods and in the conditions of formation is responsible for the difference in the degree of firmness of attachment of the natural and non-natural sanskaras to the soul. The non-natural sanskaras are not as difficult to eradicate as the natural sanskaras, which have an ancient heritage and are therefore more firmly rooted. The obliteration of the natural sanskaras is practically impossible unless the neophyte is the recipient of the grace and the intervention of a Sadguru. As explained above, the non-natural sanskaras are dependent upon the natural sanskaras, and the natural sanskaras are a result of evolution. The next important question is, why should manifested life in different stages of evolution emerge out of the absolute reality which is infinite? The need for manifested life arises out of the impetus in the absolute to become conscious of itself. The progressive manifestation of life through evolution is ultimately brought about by the will to be conscious, which is inherent in the infinite. In order to understand creation in terms of thought, it is necessary to posit this will to be conscious in the absolute in an involved state prior to the act of manifestation. And of course, later in God Speaks, Baba introduces two terribly important terms. First of all, the will to be conscious is embodied in the latent whim. And the other term that Baba brings out in God Speaks is the whole concept of latency in the original beyond state of God. Although for the purposes of an intellectual explanation of creation, the impetus in the absolute has to be regarded as a will to be conscious, to describe it as a sort of inherent desire is to falsify its true nature. It is better described as a lahar, or an impulse, which is so inexplicable, spontaneous, and sudden that to call it this or that is to have its reality undone. As all intellectual categories necessarily turn out to be inadequate for grasping the mystery of creation, the nearest approach to understanding its nature is not through intellectual concept, but through analogy. Just as a wave going across the surface of a still ocean calls forth into being a wild stir of innumerable bubbles, the lahar creates myriads of individual souls out of the indivisible infinity of the Oversoul. But the all-abounding Absolute remains the substratum of all the individual souls. The individual souls are the creations of a sudden and spontaneous impulse and have, therefore, hardly any anticipation of their destined continuity of existence throughout the cyclic period until the final subsiding of the initial tremor. Within the undifferentiated being of the Absolute is born a mysterious point through which comes forth the variegated manyness of creation, Baba's own point, and the vasty deep which, a fraction of a second before, was icy still, is astir with the life of innumerable frothy selves who secure their separateness in definite size and shape through self-limitation within the foamy surface of the ocean. All this is merely an analogy. It would be a mistake to imagine that some real change takes place in the Absolute when the lahar of the involved will to be conscious makes itself effective by bringing into existence the world of manifestation. There can be no act of involution or evolution within the being of the Absolute, and nothing real can be born from the Absolute, as any real change is necessarily a negation of the Absolute. The change implied in the creation of the manifested world is not an ontological change or a change in the being of the absolute reality. It is only an apparent change. In one sense, the act of manifestation must be regarded as a sort of expansion of the illimitable being of the Absolute, as through that act the infinite which is without consciousness seeks to attain its own consciousness. As this expansion of reality is effected through its self-limitization into various forms of life, the act of manifestation might with equal aptness be called the process of timeless contraction. Whether the act of manifestation is looked upon as a sort of expansion of reality or as its timeless contraction, it is preceded by an initial urge or movement which might, in terms of thought, be regarded as an inherent and involved desire to be conscious. The manifoldness of creation and the separateness of the individual souls exist only in imagination. The very existence of creation, or of the world of manifestation, is grounded in bhas, or illusion, so that in spite of the manifestation of numberless individual souls, the Oversoul remains the same, without suffering any real expansion or contraction, increment, or decrement. Although the Oversoul undergoes no modification due to the bhas, or illusion of individuation, there comes into existence its apparent differentiation into many individual souls. The most original bhas or illusion into which the Oversoul was allured synchronizes with the first impression. It therefore marks the beginning of the formation of Sanskaras. The formation of Sanskaras starts in the most finite center, which becomes the first focus for the manifestation of the individuality of the soul. In the gross sphere, this first focus of manifestation is represented by the tridimensional and inert stone, which has the most rudimentary and partial consciousness. Baba explained later that this had not taken into account the gaseous and subgaseous forms, which he later introduced and expanded. This vague and undeveloped state of consciousness is hardly sufficient to illumine its own shape and form, and is hopelessly inadequate to fulfill the purpose of creation, which was to enable the Oversoul to know itself. Whatever little capacity for illumination consciousness has in the stone face is ultimately derived from the Oversoul and not from the body of the stone. But consciousness is unable to enlarge its scope independently of the body of the stone, because the Oversoul first gets identified with consciousness and then through it to the stone form. Since all further development of consciousness is arrested by the body of the stone and its languor, evolution of the higher forms or vehicles of manifestation becomes indispensable. The development of consciousness has to proceed side by side with the evolution of the body by which it is conditioned. Therefore, the will to be conscious, which is inherent in the vastness of the Oversoul, seeks, by divine determination, a progressive evolution of the vehicles of expression. Thus the Oversoul forges for itself a new vehicle of expression in the mental form, in which consciousness becomes slightly more intensified. Even at this stage, it is very rudimentary, and so it has to get transferred to still higher forms of vegetation and trees, in which there is an appreciable advance in the development of consciousness through the maintenance of the vital processes of growth, decay, and reproduction. Emergence of a still more developed form of consciousness becomes possible when the Oversoul seeks manifestation through the instinctive life of insects, birds, and animals, who are fully aware of their bodies and their respective surroundings, and who develop a sense of self-protection and aim at establishing mastery over their environment. In the higher animals, intellect or reasoning also appears to a certain extent, but its working is strictly limited by the play of their instincts, like the instinct of self-protection and the instinct for the care and preservation of the little ones. So even in animals, consciousness has not had its full development, with the result that it is unable to serve the initial purpose of the Oversoul to have self-illumination. The Oversoul finally takes the human form in which consciousness attains its fullest development with complete awareness of the self and the environment. At this stage, the capacity of reasoning has the widest range of activity and is unlimited in its scope. But as the Oversoul gets identified through its consciousness with the gross body, consciousness does not serve the purpose of illuminating the nature of the Oversoul. However, as consciousness has had its fullest development in the human form, there is in it a latent potentiality for self-realization, and the will to be conscious with which evolution started becomes fructified in the Sadguru, or man-God, who is the fairest flower of humanity. The Oversoul cannot attain self-knowledge through the ordinary consciousness of humanity because it is enveloped in a multitude of sanskaras or impressions. As consciousness passes from the apparently inanimate state of the stone or the metal, then to the vegetative life of the trees, then onwards to the instinctive state of insects, birds, and animals, and finally to the full consciousness of the human state, it is continually creating new sanskaras and becoming enveloped in them. These natural sanskaras are increased even after attaining the human state by the further creation of non-natural sanskaras through manifold experiences and multitudinous activities. Thus, the acquisition of sanskaras is unceasingly going on during the process of evolution as well as during the later period of human activities. This acquisition of sanskaras may be likened to the winding up of a piece of string around a stick, the string representing the sanskaras, and the stick representing the mind of the individual soul. The winding up starts from the beginning of creation and persists through all the evolutionary stages and the human form, and the wound string represents all the positive sanskaras, natural as well as non-natural. The fresh sanskaras, which are constantly being created in human life, are due to the multifarious objects and ideas with which consciousness finds itself confronted. These sanskaras bring about important transformations in the various states of consciousness. Impressions created by beautiful objects have the potency of arousing in consciousness the innate capacity for appreciating and enjoying beauty. When one hears a good piece of music or sees a beautiful landscape, the impressions caught from these objects give one a feeling of exaltation. In the same way, when one contacts the personality of a thinker, one may become interested in new avenues of thought and inspired with an enthusiasm utterly foreign to one's consciousness formerly. Not only impressions of objects or persons, but also impressions of ideas and superstitions have great efficacy in determining the conditions of consciousness. The power of impressions of superstition might be illustrated by means of a ghost story. Of the different realms of human thought, there is perhaps none as abounding in superstitions as that connected with ghosts, who, according to popular belief, are supposed to harass and torture their victims in curious ways. Once upon a time during the Mughal rule in India, a highly educated man who was very skeptical of the stories about ghosts made up his mind to verify them from personal experience. He had been warned against visiting a certain graveyard on the night of Amavasya, the darkest night of the month, for it was reported to be the habitation of a very dreadful ghost who unfailingly made his appearance whenever an iron nail was hammered into the ground within the limits of the graveyard. With a hammer in one hand and a nail in the other, he walked straight into the graveyard on the night of Amavasya and chose a spot bare of grass in order to drive in a nail. The ground was dark, and his loosely hanging cloak was equally dark. When he sat on the ground and tried to hammer in the nail, an end of his cloak lay between the nail and the ground and was pinned down. He finished hammering and felt that he was successful with the experiment without encountering the ghost. But as he tried to rise in order to depart from the spot, he felt a strong pull towards the ground, and he became panic-stricken. Owing to the operation of previous impressions, he could not think of anything except the ghost, who, he thought, had caught him at last. The shock of the thought was so great that the poor man died of heart failure. This story illustrates the tremendous power which sometimes resides in the impressions created by superstition. The power and effect of impressions can hardly be overestimated. An impression is solidified might, and its inertness makes it immobile and durable. It can become so engraved upon the mind of man that despite his sincere desire and effort to eradicate it, it takes its own time and has a way of working itself into action directly or indirectly. The mind contains many heterogeneous sanskaras, and while seeking expression in consciousness, they often clash with each other. The clash of sanskaras is experienced in consciousness as a mental conflict. Experience is bound to be chaotic and enigmatic, full of oscillations, confusion, and complex tangles, until consciousness is freed from all sanskaras, good and bad. Experience can become truly harmonious and integral only when consciousness is emancipated from the impressions. Sanskaras can be classified according to essential differences in the nature of the spheres to which they refer. Referring to these different spheres of existence, they are found to be of three kinds. 1. Gross sanskaras, which enable the soul to experience the gross world through the gross medium and compel it to identify itself with the gross body. 2. Subtle sanskaras, which enable the soul to experience the subtle world through the subtle medium and compel the soul to identify itself with the subtle body. 3. Mental sanskaras, which enable the soul to experience the mental world through the mental medium and compel it to identify itself with the mental body. The differences between the states of the individual souls are entirely due to the differences existing in the kinds of sanskaras with which their consciousness is loaded. Thus, gross conscious souls experience only the gross world. Subtle conscious souls experience only the subtle world. And mental conscious souls experience only the mental world. The qualitative diversity in the experience of these three types of souls is due to the difference in the nature of their sanskaras. The self-conscious souls are radically different from all the other souls because they experience the oversoul through the medium of the self, whereas the other souls experience only their bodies and the corresponding worlds. This radical difference in the consciousness of self-conscious souls and of other souls is due to the fact that whereas the consciousness of most souls is conditioned by some kinds of sanskaras, the consciousness of self-conscious souls is completely free from all sanskaras. It is only when consciousness is unobscured and unconditioned by any sanskaras that the initial will to be conscious arrives at its final and real fruition, and the infinity and the indivisible unity of the Absolute is consciously realized. The problem of deconditioning the mind through the removal of sanskaras is therefore extremely important.